Welcome back to talkSPORT Endzone, talkSPORT's dedicated NFL YouTube channel with myself, Will Varney. And look, the NFL draft is just days away now. We can't wait for it all to get underway next week in Green Bay. We're going to be keeping you across all of the action, every pick here on the talkSPORT YouTube channel. And of course, on talkSPORT 2. But for now, we're doing a lot of team previews, looking at team specific needs, desires ahead of the draft getting underway next week. And we've done a lot of fantastic conversations already. Remember to like, subscribe. Also, leave us your interactions as well, what you think. We love to hear from you. But for now, we're going to be focusing on a really interesting team, I think, the Miami Dolphins. They pick outside of the top 10, but this is a team with questions about maybe the direction moving forward. And it's a pleasure to say that joining me, Doug from Dougly Do Wrong, you'll have seen his content on YouTube. Big Dolphins fan joins us on talkSPORT Endzone. Doug, how are you, my man? Thank you so much for joining us.
Doing good. Can't wait for Thursday. Get this finally over with without all the speculation anymore.
Yeah, it feels like that is the main thing whenever I speak to people. They just want to put away the mock drafts, put away the predictions, and let's find out where people are heading. I wanted to start by asking you really about the vision of this team moving forward because, I mentioned, last season the Dolphins miss out on the playoffs. It's an 8-9 record. And it felt like heading into the offseason, many people saw this as a team, maybe its last chance to run it back with this same group of players. And then we see Teron Armstead retires. We see Javon Holland walk in free agency. We see Jalen Ramsey now on the trade block. And then, of course, all the uncertainty surrounding Tyreek Hill's interest in remaining a Miami Dolphin. So, firstly, I just wanted to get your perspective on where has this seemingly all gone wrong from a team that was so hyped, especially after 2023 and how impressive that offense was, to now really? And are we witnessing a rebuild at the Miami Dolphins?
So Chris Greer and the Dolphins don't want to call it a rebuild or a retool or, anything that us outsiders want to call it. It definitely looks like it. They've gone younger and they still have a lot of holes to fill, and we'll probably get to that, but they've definitely gotten younger. And it seems like that might be the trajectory they're going in. It seems like that 3-year window was we're going to put all our chips in and win now. So they went out, got Tyreek, got Jalen Ramsey. And then last year, it seemed like it was like a last ditch effort, because they bring in Calais Campbell, who surprisingly to me, I didn't think he would be such an impact as he was, but he was just phenomenal. Even getting only like 70% of the snaps, he was consistently a big part of why the defense was as well as it was last year. But I think the biggest thing that hurt the Dolphins through that, all or nothing stretch of 3 years was the injuries. A lot of injuries to Tua last year, which definitely hurt them because, he missed about 6 games. And I think 3 of those, the Dolphins definitely could have won if he was on the field. So that puts us in an 11-win season and definitely in the playoffs. And then the year before in 2023, we get red hot, right? We had a 3-game lead on the division and everything fell apart. We lost 3 of our starting offensive linemen. We lost all of our pass rushers. Our corners got hurt. The receivers start to get banged up, and it all fell apart at the end of the year going into the playoffs, playing with pass rushers that were off the street. We had Justin Houston as our starting pass rusher against the Kansas City Chiefs. Like it just didn't bode well for the Dolphins. So I think a lot of it had to do with, building the depth, but also a lot of luck. And the Dolphins seem to have not had it these past 2 years. So it seems like right now what the Dolphins are doing is they're trying to retool it and try to bring in young, hungry players that want to prove something and hope and pray that it can pan out for them. But, my mentality is, I'd rather be surprised and let down. So I have very low expectations going into 2025.
Well, I think it's fascinating you mentioned there about that approach of, Chris Greer wanting to bring in young, hungry players who want to prove themselves and really just this general approach, because what we have seen strategy-wise, it feels like from the Dolphins in recent years is they've brought in these big-name players like Jalen Ramsey, like Tyreek Hill on big contracts, but then the players that they've drafted, they've developed, they've improved, the likes of Christian Wilkins, Andrew Van Ginkel had a phenomenal year with the Vikings last year. Javon Holland letting him walk, Robert Hunt. They've let these guys walk. What do you make of that overall approach? And has that done more harm than good when you look at the overall roster right now?
I think a lot of it had to do with their decisions on when to pay these players, but also decisions on who they wanted to pay. Because Javon Holland, he should have gotten a contract before last year, because that Jets game in 2023 where he hurt both of his knees, it looked like it kind of took a toll on him,
Mm.
it's probably going to take a year for him to get back to the Javon Holland that we all know. Same thing with Andrew Van Ginkel. Andrew Van Ginkel wanted to stay a Dolphin. They didn't even offer him a contract. He would have took anything. They gave it to Shaq Barrett, who ended up retiring and then going back to Tampa Bay. Like, they should have kept Andrew Van Ginkel. But it seems like that was the MO of the Dolphins. It was a lot of, Christian Wilkins, they fought hard and hard to keep him. Same thing with Robert Hunt, but their price just got too expensive. And then again, you're paying Tyreek Hill top money. You're paying Jalen Ramsey top money. And then you Tua Tagovailoa, you give him a new contract. All of a sudden it becomes a situation where you chose the wrong pieces to give all that money to, and you kind of lose out. Now, I'm a proprietor of thinking you built through the trenches. So if I could have, I would have given Wilkins the money, and I would have given Robert Hunt the money. And I know at the time that they offered him a contract, Robert Hunt, it was like around 15 million, but he bet on himself and he won. Same thing with Christian Wilkins. They offered him a contract around 18 million, and he bet on himself and he won. And sometimes you get in those situations where you offer contracts and then they bet on themselves. Connor Williams did the same thing, but he unfortunately didn't win. He had a massive injury that held him out for a while. But I think that's the biggest thing is they waited too long, and then players bet on themselves and they won. So now the Dolphins were in a situation where they're trying to figure this out, kind of a little bit in a cap hell because of the people they paid and because of giving extensions. And then they were in a situation they couldn't pay everybody.
And like you say, these decisions were made by the front office, and it's the GM Chris Greer is seen as quite a polarizing figure right now. It feels like from the Dolphins fan base, and I just wanted to ask you talk about his future and of course the head coach Mike McDaniel. Mike McDaniel only signed a new contract last off season, and then Chris Greer does feel like he's almost part of the furniture within this organization because of his history with the team. So right now, with the amount of sort of heat and the conversations about their future, what should the minimum expectations be if they are to remain in their jobs, would you say?
For me, they have to win a playoff game.
Okay.
Like, for them to keep their jobs, they have to win a playoff game. Chris Greer has been doing this rebuild since 2019. He got the job in 2016, but he kind of had Mike Tannenbaum overlooking a lot of his decisions, and you had Adam Gase who had control of the roster. And then in 2019, he got the reins. So he essentially pitched an idea to Stephen Ross. Look, we're going to tear it down in 2019, get all the draft capital we can, and build up this team for longevity. And it's now been going on to 6 years, and we are nowhere better than we were back then. So for me, a minimum, you have to win a playoff game. And same thing with Mike McDaniel. Last year I wanted to fire Chris Greer after we started 2-6. My thought process was move on from Greer, bring in your GM, and have the GM watch Mike McDaniel for the rest of the year and let him make the decision. We're going to stick with McDaniel for one more year. And I think when you look at how the season ended, that probably would have been the decision, because McDaniel actually didn't do too bad at the back end stretch of that season, but there were very good candidates out there like Vrabel and like Johnson and all those guys. So that's what I would have done. But for right now, they have to win. And it doesn't seem like they're building towards winning, because again, we have one starting defensive lineman right now. You need at least 4 or 5 for a rotation. We don't have a left guard. Now we don't really have a corner because they're going to trade Jalen Ramsey, and you have 2 starting safeties that, they're starters, but are there anyone that you would be scared of facing at the back end of the field? So, if my thought process is if they start 2-6 again, they're both probably going to get fired. And if not, then I don't know what the plan is with this team.
Well, I know in a recent video you said it's almost like the pair are acting as if their jobs aren't at risk. So it is
Exactly.
going to be a fascinating situation, especially when you mentioned there the lack of depth in this team. And I suppose that moves
Mhm.
us on to the draft. And looking at the 10 picks that the Dolphins have, the bulk of those are on the final day of the draft, but they still have that first rounder, 13th overall. Just in terms of the depth, let's talk about it, because it doesn't feel like right now, you mentioned there defensive line, offensive line, cornerback, safety. You could arguably take 2 players at each of those positions and still do the needs outweigh the actual possibility that the Dolphins can fill these spots within the draft?
So Chris Greer did his presser on Tuesday, pre-draft presser, and his thought process was the draft is built in a way that it fills their needs, but to hit, you need starters, right? So we got 3 picks in the first 100. You need to get at least 5 or 6 starters out of this draft out of 10. That's if you get 3 starters out of a 10 pick draft, you're a good GM. And to get 6 is nearly impossible unless you're Grossman for the Eagles.
Mm.
Apparently that man has the luck of, Jalen Carter falling him to the end of the first and stuff. It's just ridiculous. But this draft is kind of built for what the Dolphins need, right? Like they need defensive linemen. This draft is deep with defensive
Mm.
linemen. They need corners. You have 2 good corners that'll probably go in the first. You have a bunch that could go in the second, even end of the first. Offensive linemen, they're good. I like Gray Zabel, but he probably will go in early first. Jonas Avellaneda, I really like him. They could possibly get him in the second. So there is possibilities there, but you want more picks. And if I'm the Dolphins, that's where I'm thinking. Let me get one more pick in the top 100, so I can get 4 in the top 100 and really kind of address all those needs at corner, guard, defensive line, and safety. If I can get 1 starter out of all 4 come out of that draft, I'd be happy.
Well, so then looking at that position, because it feels like there is a lack of sort of blue chip caliber players within this draft, but they're still good players. So it feels like a lot of teams are going to be potentially wanting to trade down. It's just about, if you're going to do that dance, can you find the partner who wants to come up? With where the Dolphins pick, do you look at, say, the Bengals or maybe the Falcons, who are wanting to get a pass rusher, for example, and sort of take that spot? Is that the perfect? Would you say that would be the perfect thing to happen for the Dolphins then, if they could trade back and maybe get an extra pick where they could find another quality piece potentially?
Yeah, I think that would be like the best case scenario for the Dolphins is for you're sitting there at 13. Like I don't think Genti falls to 13. I think if he doesn't go to the Raiders, he'll go to the Cowboys. If Membu falls to 13, the Dolphins are taking him. There's no way.
Mm.
But the biggest name that I think is interesting is Shador Sanders. Now, people like Shador Sanders. He doesn't have the greatest of arm. He's kind of like Tua, but more mobile. So you're looking at the people in the top 12 and you're looking at who would take a quarterback. And there's a few, like the Saints will probably take a quarterback and Jets might take a quarterback. But if Shador falls and he's there at 13, then it gets real interesting because you'll have teams that, like the Steelers. The Steelers would, going from 21 to 13, could possibly, help the Dolphins out, give them some of their, draft picks. They don't have many, but they could do something there. There's other, if Barron and Will Johnson are there, maybe Atlanta or Arizona might want to move up. There's a ton of possibilities because maybe some of these quarterback needy teams overreach. Like if Jackson Dart goes in the top 12, it's going to blow my mind. But we saw Daniel Jones go super early to the Giants. So, Penix Jr. goes to the Falcons when they just signed Kirk Cousins. So nothing's out of the normal when it comes to a draft. So if all of a sudden there's some really good talent there and the Dolphins could take it, like, hey, we can move back and still get somebody we need, that would be perfect. Because like I said, if we can get another third or a second and get another pick in that top 100, there's a lot of talent. That's like the bread and butter, is kind of like from the back end of the first to like the beginning of the third, you have a lot of good talent there. So like you would just sacrifice getting that A talent to get a bunch of Bs. But at this point right now, the Dolphins need a lot of Bs. So I would be all for trading back. And Chris Greer kind of hinted at it as well.
Final couple of questions from me, Doug. Looking then at that position of the 13th overall, especially the news that's recently come out in the last week or so about Jalen Ramsey, it feels like people feel like almost that first round pick is a certainty to be a cornerback, whether it is Will Johnson or Jahdae Barron. Do you feel like it should be a corner at the 13th overall pick if they are to select someone? Or are you looking at another position group? Are you looking at the offensive line? Are you looking at the defensive line? What would you prioritize?
I would do best available. So, it sucks that they're not going into the draft with that mindset. Like, say Warren's there, Tyler Warren, take Tyler Warren. He's the best player. Yes, he's a tight end and the Dolphins have Jonnu Smith, but we're good everywhere else. That's what I would have liked to gone into the draft with. But the Dolphins have so many needs that I would just do best available. So whether it's Calvin Banks and they can move him to guard, whether it's Grant, they need a defensive lineman, whether it's um, Malachi Starks, they need a safety, or if it's Jade Barron or if it's Will Johnson, take one of those. I would more focus on taking somebody who there isn't that big depth in, so possibly offensive lineman or safety, because I know safeties kind of fall off. Whereas like corners in that second round, you can still probably get like a Trey Amos, you
Mm.
can get a Siobhan Ravel. Those guys are still really good. Same thing with offensive linemen. Like I said, Jonas Savannah, there's some guys, even defensive tackle, that you can get in that second round. So that's probably what they're going to do, is see, okay, who's available, and if we miss on this guy, can we make up for it on the back end? So for me, it might be safety. Like I like Emanwari. He's like
Mm.
one of my favorites. I love his build, I love his speed and everything. But Malachi Starks is also really good. So I wouldn't be against taking a safety at 13.
Just before we wrap up, I did want to ask you about the future of Tyreek Hill, because there's obviously so much talk about, Chris Greer only this week was saying, calling off the rumours of a trade. He was saying it would pique my interest if I got offered 2 first-rounders, but I feel like that's a bit wishful thinking. In terms of Tyreek, do you feel like he will remain a Dolphin for this upcoming season? And from a personal standpoint, would you want him to remain a Dolphin?
It's a good question. From a personal standpoint, him on the field is dynamic, right? He's going to stretch the field. Him and Tua have a connection. So you see it when Tua's on the field. Tyreek goes off. He gets the yards. When Tua's not on the field, it seems like every other quarterback has a hard time getting the ball to him. So there's that. On the field, the Tyreek Hill's great. Off the field, it's where the headaches come in and where a bunch of distractions come in. And then you have what happened at the end of last season, where he essentially took himself out. And then, what makes it worse is that audio clip of Waddle asking him, "Are you done?" And then him post game saying, "I'm out, peace out." So, there's a lot of that stuff going on. And, the Dolphins like to say that they mended that bridge, but he still trolls the fans a lot
Yeah.
by, tweeting out a bunch of things. I think they have until August. I think there's some clause in his contract that triggers in August for the 2025 season. So, him and Ramsey to be traded in the draft or before the draft would be very hard to do because of the cap ramifications. Because I know Jalen Ramsey, it's like negative $15 million. And then Tyreek Hill, it's negative 500,000, and they both have a dead cap. Whereas post June 1st, there's a ton of cap savings. So, Ramsey, I don't see getting traded during the draft. After the draft, of course, the Dolphins will probably look at teams that needed a corner, missed out on them, and probably pick up the phone and call them, say, "Hey, give us this," or whatever. And then same thing with Tyreek Hill. If he were to get traded, it'll probably happen after the draft. A lot of these wide receiver needy teams, crap, we missed out on so and so. Let's call the Dolphins. And I could see a trade for Tyreek Hill being straight up like a third. That could be a second. Like, you're not going to get anything crazy. And then for Jalen Ramsey, it'll probably be like a fourth, because we got him for a third. So maybe a fourth or a swap of a player, maybe a guard or something if the Dolphins didn't get. But, to see Tyreek Hill in 2025 wouldn't shock me. To see Ramsey in 2025 would shock me.
Well, it's going to be intriguing to see what does happen, especially with the overall future for the Miami Dolphins, not just heading into 2025, but beyond as well, with Mike McDaniel, Chris Greer. Doug, just before I let you go, just remind us how we can keep up with all the great content you're doing on YouTube at Dougley Does Wrong.
So I have my YouTube channel, youtube.com/LuckyDoWrong. I year round. I really don't take a break. So a lot of times when that dead part comes in June, I have to make up content, which is kind of hard to do. But I pull it off. I cover mini camps, OTAs, everything you need to know about the Dolphins and the NFL. Also, you can see my stuff on DolphinsTalk.com. So check me out there. And I got some side shows going on, like the Dolphin Collective and the starting lineup. I got a lot of stuff in the works. So keep an ear out.
Dolphins fans, you know where to go if it all goes wrong come next Thursday, that's for sure. Doug, thank you so much for joining us on talkSPORT End Zone. Wishing you all the best for the draft next week. I hope it all goes well from your perspective, and we look forward to catching up soon.
I appreciate it. I had a blast.